So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about replicating parts and assemblies. So, we're going to talk about all the ways that we have for inserting multiple parts or assemblies into your Onshape assemblies. So, that's the goal. As I say with all of our webinars, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog in your GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to type in anything, and I'll do my best to stop and address any questions as they pop up. So, let's jump right into things. The goal for today is really simple. It's going to be a very short webinar, just going to focus on really 4 key things that we can do in Onshape assemblies that make it easy to insert multiple instances of parts or subassemblies. So let's jump into it now. The agenda, real quickly, first discuss inserting multiple parts in assemblies. Where do we do these things? What's the best technique for doing them and so on? But then I want to get into the various methods that we have. And that's, of course, copy and paste, which I'm going to show you in just a bit. The easiest way, a simple way to insert multiple instances. But then we have more advanced tools, things like Replicate, which allows you to replicate based on geometry in the assembly. On top of that, we also have the typical linear and circular patterns. These are actually recently announced, so if you haven't used Onshape in a while, we now have the ability to do both linear and circular patterns of parts and subassemblies at the assembly level in Onshape. So I'm going to go over an example of both of these as well, but these are really the 4 primary methods that we have for replicating or inserting multiple parts or assemblies into your assembly. So let's jump into things. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is inserting multiple parts and assemblies. You can insert as many parts and assemblies into your top level assembly as you'd like. So there's really no limit to the level of parts or assemblies or subassemblies that you can create. And you can organize it in really any fashion that you'd like. So a lot of those decisions about where to put parts and subassemblies and so on are entirely up to you. Keep in mind that when you insert parts into your assembly, you can drag them into subassemblies right from the instance list in your assembly. So the list of all your parts, you can grab and drag and insert into other subassemblies from that as well. So you have a lot of options for inserting multiple parts. I think the big thing that I want to get across to end users is when we talk about instancing, inserting multiple parts that are all the same, you want to do that at the assembly level and not at the Part Studio level. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of this in a little bit greater detail in just a second, but that's the key thing to take away when we're talking about inserting multiple parts. If I have a dozen bolts that go into my assembly, you'll want to make sure to insert all of those at the assembly level. And we have a few different tools that make that easy. So let's go into the first method that I want to discuss here today. And again, as I mentioned, very short webinar. I really just want to focus on these 4 different techniques. So again, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like through the questions dialog in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll do my best to stop and address them. So the first one that I want to discuss is, of course, copying and paste. And this is probably one of the easiest, most common methods. As you can imagine, it's very similar to copy and pasting a file, for example, in Windows Explorer. Control-C, Control-V. If you're familiar with that keyboard shortcut, it works exactly how you'd expect it to work in Onshape. So if I select a part and I select Control-C, then I move my cursor out somewhere and then select Control-V, I will copy and paste that part. I'm going to show you an example of this. So Control-C, Control-V in Windows and Linux, Command-C, Command-V if you're using a Mac. Now, the other way to do this, and another very common one I think for most users, is just to right-click. If you select a series of parts or just a single part, you can right-click it and say Copy, and then right-click an empty space and say Paste, and then you insert another instance of that part. So this is probably the easiest way to insert multiple parts. And the question has popped up already, and it's a very good one. Can this be used also for subassemblies? The answer is yes. So you can also right-click a subassembly, say Copy, and then right-click and paste. Okay. You can also window select many different parts and right-click Copy, right-click Paste. So you have a number of different options. Command-C, Command-V if you like keyboard shortcuts, right-click menu if you prefer the mouse. Either way, very easy to insert multiple instances. Now, this is definitely the most manual approach of everything that I'm going to show you here today. We have tools like Replicate and Pattern that make it very easy to insert a lot of instances and also locate them. this is going to be the most manual approach, but if you're looking for just a way to throw in another O-ring so that you can manually mate it up, that's an easy way to accomplish it. So let's jump into an example of this. Let me jump out of the slides real quickly and go into Onshape. Now, you'll notice that I'm in the assembly, of course, and this is where we're doing all of these inserting of parts, multiple instances of parts you want to insert at the assembly level. The reason I bring this up is if I jump into the part studio, initially it looks very similar to the assembly. There's no end piece here, but a lot of the parts are here. Notice, though, that the O-ring has only been modeled once. So I actually have two places for an O-ring. But because the O-ring is exactly the same, it's actually the same instance of the part in the second groove, I did not model a second O-ring in the part studio. And the reason for that is because I want to insert that as an instance in my assembly. And this is just so that we have, correct quantity counts of bill of materials and so on. Question that's come up. Can you highlight and control drag a part? No. You can right click a part, and I'm going to show you that in just a second, but highlight, control, drag does not give you a copy. No. All right, so I mentioned before, when we build in the part studio, here's all the sketches and revolves and sweeps that we use to construct the parts. You want to make sure to model unique parts only, and only once in this case. So in this case, I have the O-ring. I've only modeled it once in the part studio, and now I have a second instance I can insert at the assembly. Okay. So moving on to the assembly level, this is where I want to insert multiple instances of that O-ring. And in this case, as I mentioned before, there's a number of ways we could do this. One of the easiest is literally a Command C, Command V, or a Control C, Control V if you're using Windows or Linux. So Command C, I'll select the O-ring, of course. So I selected the O-ring, Command C, click out an empty space, Command V, and it will insert another instance of the O-ring, right? So you'll see O-ring with an instance of 1. Here's O-ring instance 2. Okay. So that's a simple way to insert multiples, and I can continue. So if I had multiple O-rings, I can keep clicking Control C or Command V, I should say, and insert multiple parts. So I don't have to keep going back. And it's a very easy way if I needed 5 or 6 that needed to be manually mated. That's an easy way to get them into the assembly. I do not have to go back to the insert dialog. Okay. So just a tip, the Control C, Control V is a big one. Now, another way that you could do this is the right-click method. So if you don't care for keyboard shortcuts, you can right-click a part in the assembly, and you'll see Copy, right? And then I can right-click and paste that O-ring, right? So just keep in mind you can create multiple instances of the O-ring in my example, just using the right-click method. Just right-click the part, copy, right-click anywhere you in space that you want to place it, paste, and it'll paste another instance of that part in. And that also works, by the way, with multiple parts. So you do not have to be specific with a single part. I can right-click and copy 3 items and paste. So you can right-click and copy, right-click and paste multiple items, even subassemblies from within Onshape. So right-click method is very popular. The keyboard shortcuts for Control C, Control V, a lot of users are just familiar with those keyboard shortcuts. Those are used in many different applications. Same workflow applies in Onshape. Is the examples you're using available to me after webinar to practice? I do not believe these are public models, forgive me. Why wouldn't you create the O-ring in a separate part studio and assemble as many as you want in an assembly? There's really no difference between assembling or modeling the O-ring in a separate part studio, or in this case, in the part studio with the other parts. The big benefit I get from modeling the O-ring in this environment, not by itself, is I can reference the cylinder that it attaches to. That's a lot of user preference. Many users would model the O-ring in its own tab, so I wouldn't argue that one is better than the other necessarily. A user asked, are you holding shift while selecting multiple parts? The answer is no. In Onshape, you do not have to hold shift. So I just left click, left click, left click, and I've now selected 3 parts. You do not have to hold any keyboard shortcuts. Now, another big tip that I have with regards to selection is eventually you're going to reach a point where you don't want these selected. Use the space bar to deselect anything. So if you select the space bar, it deselects. How are we representing the stretch of the O-ring? We're not. This is a very simple example of essentially a circle swept along a circle, another arc. But there is a tool I would definitely recommend checking out. It's on our feature script page that will allow you to define squeeze percentages, forgive me. And it's a very neat O-ring specific command. This is just a simple sweep. All right, so let's move on. Now, I mentioned before copy and paste. That's the first technique. Control C, Control V, Command C, Command V, or right click, and you'll see the copy option in the right click menu. You can select subassemblies from the feature list or instance list in the left side. So I could right click here and also have the option to copy. So just another tip, you do not have to necessarily do it from the graphics. And you can also window select multiple parts. You can select left clicking individual parts. It's a very, I would say, manual way, but it's easier than the insert method, right? So you're still selecting the parts individually and still have to mate them, but it is faster than using insert. So what do we have on top of this, right? This is the easy way, but it's not necessarily the fastest way, especially if there's duplicates that have references to other things. Maybe I have, evenly spaced instances of bolts, or I have, a number of parts around a cylinder, or I have a number of parts based on certain edges or definition. So you can automate this. This is probably the slowest approach to inserting multiple parts aside from using the insert dialog. The faster approaches come when we start talking about commands like replicate and our pattern commands. So let's jump into that. Now, replicate, as the name implies, allows you to replicate parts or assemblies based on matching geometry, surrounding geometry. So what it does is essentially looks for geometry that's similar to the mated pieces and automatically replicates parts to that similar geometry. So here I've got a simple example where I've got these work holding clamps. These are subassembly clamps that are holding down this part. And this fixture base has, a dozen or so holes. And these holes all match. They're all intended for that port. So it's easy for me to replicate one subassembly across the entire thing by saying, just find all the matching edges on this face. And it will automatically grab anything that's exactly the same and pattern all the parts to that similar geometry. So replicate is a very powerful way to pattern things like hardware. If you think of bolts, I can say, find all the matching faces, and in this case edges, and it will find all the holes with the same diameter and apply all the bolts to the holes automatically without having to do patterns or insert them one at a time. So replicate has the ability to just recognize the face geometry and then automatically apply parts to anything that matches. So you have a few options when it comes to matches. You can match faces and parts. You can match faces and features, as well as individual edges. So let's say that I didn't want to pattern to all of the holes, maybe just 2 or 3. I can match individual edges as well. Question, is there a drag window selection for the entire assembly? You can window select and it will grab all the parts within the assembly. I would recommend using the instance list if you want to do something specific to a subassembly. You can select that as a single item in the instance list on the left, and it's a much more accurate way of accomplishing it. You could window select. I don't know that that's the method I would recommend personally. All right, so replicate. Let's walk through an example of this. As I mentioned before, it's really all about matching surrounding geometry. So here I have that example. And if you look at this, it's a simple fixture. And I have one work holding clamp that I've mated in place, right? So in this case, you'll see I have one clamp but many holes. And these holes are all exactly the same. If I were to hide this subassembly, you'll see that the hole is exactly the same. I just have a fasten mate that attaches the work holding clamp to that hole. But in this case, you'll see many holes that are exactly the same. And essentially what we're telling it is, I want you to pattern this subassembly, this clamp subassembly, to all the instances of the holes. Okay? And the neat thing is it will replicate not just all the parts, but all the mates associated with it. And this is a bit different than the linear and circular pattern where it's just, kind of a blind number. It's 5x amount of distance. The replicate command will not only behave better to geometry changes, right? If I were to change the hole's locations, I would get updates to the subassembly's locations rather than just using a blind value like a linear pattern, for example. So it has the ability to update to changes because it's replicating all the mates and so on. Very, very powerful command. So think of any scenario where you're trying to apply a certain series of parts or just a single part to a certain type of geometry that you've already created at the Part Studio level. So in my case, I want to take this work holding clamp and pattern it to all the instances of the holes. I'll choose Replicate. I'll select the instances. Now this has come up a few times. Can I window select? Can I drag? And the answer is yes. You could come in and window select parts. You may find it hard to find to select the exact ones that you're looking for. And in the case of a subassembly, it's much easier just to click on it in the actual instance list. All right, so I can say work holding clamp, right, and you'll see it grabs all the parts. It's essentially grabbing the subassembly as a single thing. And what it does is it recognizes, and this is hard to see, I'm not sure how clear it's going to be through GoToWebinar, but it actually highlights the geometry it's referencing. And then what it says is, okay, I found this geometry that the subassembly is referencing. Now I'm going to find everything that's the same on this face and do that same thing to it. All right. So now I can say match edges on face and just click the face. It will automatically go through and find all the edges that match and replicate the geometry to all those edges. Now, I'm using a work holding clamp example with a few parts. This could just as easily be a series of bolts that you want to place in a pattern, or you already have the holes modeled. Just tell it, pattern all the bolts wherever you find this matching edge. Right? Now, you may not want all of the edges or all of the holes. So let's say, for example, I wanted one or two, but not all of them. So you have another option. You actually have two other options. You can match edges on plane, which behaves very similarly, but instead of referencing a face, it references a plane. But you can also reference individual edges, right? And this allows me to say, okay, I want this edge and maybe this edge, but no others, right? So I can go through and kind of selectively define matching edges, and it will pattern or replicate the subassembly to those edges. Okay, I hit the green check OK, and now I have replicated that work holding clamp in the assembly. Some things I like to point out about this is it is not only replicating the geometry, but also the mates. So you'll see a fastened mate here for each one of these instances, just like the original had. So it's mating not just the parts, but also the mates that attached them to whatever it is that you're referencing. Right. So definitely a very powerful command. This one, I think, negates the need to do a lot of simple mate assemblies where you have nothing but a lot of mates that place basic parts. If you use something like this, it simplifies and speeds up the process quite a bit. Questions. Are the mates the same? Yes, it is replicating the mates. Is the mate required for replicate to work? Now, it's just looking for similar geometry. I'm fairly certain it's not required, but I could be wrong, so forgive me. I'm not 100% certain on that. If you had a part with no mates, how would it behave? I would have to try that myself. In a big assembly, can I quickly find out how many work holding clamps are inside? What I would recommend is using something like in the App Store. You can select OpenBOM, and it will tell you instance counts. It will actually grab the instance counts and so on. So that's an easy way to determine like the quantity of parts. There's also a bill of materials app in the App Store that's built into Onshape, so it's another easy way. So a few different approaches that you might take a look at. How can I use this for the ends of hoses into holes? Yeah, again, you would define the holes, and I assume just pattern or replicate, insert one instance of the hose, mate it, and then replicate it by selecting the end face or matching edges. Do I need to add a mate to each of the edges, or if it is an odd one? You may need to add an additional mate if it doesn't fully define it. It depends on the scenario. Yeah, clamps need to be oriented to the face. That's correct. And it's important to point out it is replicating the exact orientation and everything of the work holding clamps. It even replicates, in this case, the degrees of freedom of the subassembly. So I'm still free to rotate this and it's still free to move because it's a subassembly, right? Because all subassemblies are free to move in Onshape. How can you control the orientation of the replicated parts? You just grab and move them afterwards. So I can grab this and do a simple translate, rotate. I can just grab and drag if I wanted to as well. Right. You could also add a mate in the subassembly that more correctly defines this, so that when I do replicate it, I just don't have that here. In my case, the clamps are free to move up and down and free to rotate. Question: would replicate be helpful when I'm placing pistons into an assembly? Yeah, absolutely. You could use, mate one piston into your assembly and use perhaps the top edge of the engine block where the bore passes through to the top edge of the block. Use that edge to define. So I think so. I think in this case it depends on the details specifically, but it sounds like it would work great. Can you change the angle of the clamp? Yes, you can grab and rotate. Again, it's free to move with respect to the subassembly. The subassembly has that movement in it. So yeah, the questions have come up a few times now. Can you change the angle? Can you replicate? Or can the replicated part be moved or rotated? The answer is yes. In this case, it's a subassembly, and that subassembly was free to move. Therefore, any replicated instances of it are also free to move. Question: in the instance list gets big with repeated same parts, can this be packed like an NX9? We don't have a way to create like a folder or a pack or any kind of way of compressing the feature list as of today. The instance list, there's no way to do that specifically today, but that is something that we're hoping to address soon. It's definitely something that we've heard from a lot of users. So keep an eye out. It's something that we're aware of, definitely. Is there a demo on using the App Store? We definitely have a video. I think I've done a webinar on the App Store, so check it out if you're looking for a video specifically on the App Store. Check out our YouTube channel. If you do a search on a YouTube channel for Onshape App Store, I'm sure you'll find a few different videos. Can you replicate on more than one face? You can do more than one replicate. You can do as many replicates as you'd like. Can I select all instances of a certain part used? Can I select all instances of a certain part used? That's a good question. I'm not aware of a way to say select all similar, select all the same. I do not think so. I'm not 100% certain, so forgive me, but I do not think so. I could. Yeah, I do not think so, so forgive me. May I use copy and paste for a sketch that is in another document and import it with this method? You can use derived feature to insert a sketch from another part into another part. So from one part into another, I should say. I would look at the derived feature if you're trying to insert a sketch from one part into another and derive one sketch with another and so on. Can you select multiple faces? Can you select multiple faces? You would need multiple commands. I'm fairly certain of that. Just testing this, so bear with me. You can define multiple faces, so it's not going to stop you from selecting multiple faces. So forgive me, that is wrong. I mentioned before you would need to use multiple replicates. You do not. You can select multiple faces, so it will allow you to select more than one. All right, so moving on. I just added 100 parts of using Replicate. Work great, but very noisy in the instance. But yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely something we're aware of. So keep in mind, the organization of the instance list and feature list is something that we're aware of and working on. How would I replicate all instances of bolt with a new one? You would insert the one. So insert one bolt, mate it, and then use replicate. How do we know which features relate to what part name? When you select a feature for instance, I'm selecting fasten, it will select the part, or in this case, subassembly, that it's referencing, and it will also highlight visually those things. The same thing goes, by the way, when you select it in the Part Studio. If you select a feature in the Part Studio, it will highlight in the graphics. You can also select the part itself. It will highlight the part, the part in the graphics. So you should be able to either select feature, subassembly, mate, or any other thing in the feature list and have it highlight visually. All right, so moving on. The next things that I want to get into are the assembly, circular, and linear pattern. So just bear with me for a second here. So this is what a lot of users are currently familiar with in a lot of other CAD systems, just a simple way of saying, I want to take this part and pattern it a certain distance or around a certain cylindrical edge or face a certain number of times. And it's often referred to as quote unquote, a dumb pattern. It's using a fixed spacing and instance count. So unlike Replicate, it's a little more vulnerable to model design changes. Replicate will recognize changes in geometry and update. In the case of a linear pattern, it's just using a number and an instance count. So it's going a certain distance, a certain number of times. And the same thing goes for a circular pattern. So question that's come up real quickly, can I change the appearance of one instance to highlight it from the others? You can. You can change the individual part appearance within a subassembly at that level. Okay. Moving on. Assembly, linear, and circular pattern. What I'd like to do is get into an example. So I'd like to take this tie rod and the nuts on the ends of the cylinder and pattern them around the other instances. Okay. So let's do that. Now, very simple. Right next to Replicate in the toolbar, you'll find linear and circular pattern. This is a simple example of circular pattern. So I select circular, then I select the parts you want to pattern. So very simple, in this case, the tie rod, the nut, and the other nut on the other end. Okay. So I take those three parts. Those are the parts that I want to pattern. Then I define the axis of pattern. And the easiest way to do this is to select any cylindrical or edge or face. So in this case, I have this cylindrical edge. That defines the center of rotation. So think of a circular pattern. You have that center point to rotate the pattern around. This is what you're referencing. And you could use a cylindrical edge, cylindrical face. Either works. In this case, I select the cylindrical edge. And you'll see 2 instance count. So you'll see that second instance count. In this case, I'll set it to 4. And now we have 4 of them. So real simple. Keep in mind I have 2 options checked that you want to make sure of. This is an evenly spaced 360-degree pattern. So in this case, the angle 360 degrees is of course a full circle. I want 4 equally spaced over that 360 degrees. You do not necessarily have to do that. So you can say I want 4 patterned over 90 degrees, for example. You don't necessarily have to have 360 degree for a full 360. You can specify whatever angle you want, and you can even have them as not equal spacing, right? Instance count between them. So it's up to you how you decide to define that. But in this case, 360 is what I need. That gives me 4 evenly spaced instances along the example. Okay. So just a tip. The question: what if you made 3 over 270, for example? You'll see the 270, the third, is right here at the bottom of the center. Okay, so evenly spaced over 270. Question. Change the appearance. Can you make one? Oh, I apologize. This is a question from earlier that I misunderstood. This is, can I change the appearance of one instance to highlight it from the others? And now can you make one green? This is the same question from the same user. Forgive me, I misunderstood. what you're referring to is changing the color, for instance, of this one and distinguishing it from other instances within this. And forgive me, I misunderstood originally. The appearances are defined at the Part Studio level. So the answer, in short, to your question, I believe, is no. If you define an appearance, it's at the Part Studio level, and it would change in all instances. So forgive me, I misunderstood originally. What if you did 3/270? I showed you that. Can you make a pattern? Can you pattern a mate along with the part? And the answer is yes, but you would be using Replicate and not a circular or a linear pattern. It's important to keep in mind with a circular or linear pattern, the circular instance count, the circular edge, you define the instance count. That's really what drives it. And the same goes with a linear pattern. With a linear pattern, it's the edge and a distance and instance count. That's what drives it. So those are specific to those applications. If you wanted something that patterns the mates alongside of it, and something that may be potentially faster, Replicate has the ability to do that. Replicate is a little bit more robust in some of these scenarios. Okay, so original is included in the final pattern. That's a very good point. This is a comment from a user. The original is included in the instance count. So in the example I showed you a moment ago, we had instance count of 3. That includes the parts that I've selected. So it's a very important distinction, a very good point to make. Can you suppress instances? You can suppress the feature. I can suppress the part. Forgive me. I right-click here. Suppress part 7. So yes, you can right-click and suppress instances within that patterned assembly or parts. Now I want to mention, I showed this with Replicate, but it also works at the circular pattern and linear pattern level, is you can also circular or linear pattern assemblies in your top level assembly. So you can do that as well. It's not specific. Copy and paste works with sub-assemblies. Replicate works with sub-assemblies, and circular and linear pattern also work with sub-assemblies. All right, so let's move on. Now I have one more quick example of circular pattern, so if you would bear with me. And this is another example where I have this bolt circle and I want to pattern the whole across all sides of it. Very easy to do. Circular pattern, select the instance, just in this case the bolt. The axis of pattern, I can select the circular face and then say, okay, I want 6 evenly spaced instances over 360 degrees. And that gives me 6 bolts for my bolt circle. Okay, green check. There we go. Questions. Version part first to isolate. Can you change if circular pattern clockwise or counterclockwise? When you define the circular pattern, you do have a reverse or opposite direction. Okay. So just keep in mind there is that opposite direction next to your instance count that you can set. And that goes for linear pattern, which we're going to show in just a moment. Can the tie rod be patterned linearly? Yes. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Bear with me. Is it possible to create pattern from pattern in one of the other parts? In other words, use the existing bolt pattern in one of the cylinder heads. I could then take these parts that consist of a circular pattern and linear pattern them. Yes. Forgive me if that doesn't answer your question. Hard to see why you'd want to pattern at the assembly level rather than replicate given the mate issues. Can you discuss? I think in many situations you want just a dumb pattern in number and value. In this example, I could have used replicate and using the whole as a reference. Assuming that that's the way it was correctly mated, that's an easy way to do it. But you will have scenarios where that's not the case. This is a great one. So this is my linear pattern example. There isn't really an edge that represents how I want to define, the pattern. So if I look at this, this is a simple, beam that I want to pattern along these 2 frame pieces. There isn't really any edges to define a pattern instance. And really what I want is just, every foot, I want another beam with another V block. Right? And in that case, linear pattern makes more sense. So replicate is very powerful. It's what I think most users will use when you have referenceable edges or faces. But if you don't have that, or if you just want, like in my example, a fixed linear distance and instance count, the linear patterns work well for that. Okay. Can I put independent comments on each instance? Yes, you can. Right-click one instance. It is a part, and you can add comments to it. So yes. In the instance that a feature is not rendered in a circular pattern, can I go in and make a hole, even if it's not aligned with set axis? You could, if you had to create something manually, you could create something manually and reference it. I've seen that done in the worst case scenario. So if you wanted to update the replicated part, you could. Of course, it's going to update all instances of it. Once you accept one of the parts, can you go back and delete it? Very good question. I do not believe so. Let's try in the feature list. No, I can suppress, but I do not have a delete option. No, I believe the answer to that's going to be no. I'll try that again as we end the webinar here, just to make sure I'm not missing something, but forgive me. Can the pattern spacing be controlled by a formula? You can use simple math in a assembly. So I can say 3 divided by 2 plus 1 or something like that. So you could use something like that. Can I split the instance by versioning? Are you referring to inserting multiple versions of a part into an assembly? Forgive me, I'm still not understanding. All right, so moving on. That is the circular pattern. So jumping back real quickly, I have one last example for you, and that is the linear pattern. And like you can imagine, instead of patterning parts by around a cylinder, around a circle, we're patterning them based on a linear direction and a spacing and instance count. So very similar to the linear pattern at the part studio level, except for, of course, we're patterning parts at the assembly level. So let me go over a few examples of this. Very simple. Let's jump into the assembly. And what I have here is a simple frame with a V-block and some shafts. And what I like to do is pattern the V-block and then the base piece attaching to it along this entire frame. Okay. So simple example, you'll find again linear pattern right next to replicate. I'll select linear pattern. Select the instances with the part or assemblies that you want to pattern, in this case, the V block. Okay. Now select a direction. Remember, you're specifying a linear direction to pattern. So I'm saying I want to pattern parallel to this thing. And the easiest reference is just something like a simple edge that represents the direction that you want to pattern. So I want to say I want to pattern parallel to this edge. Right? As soon as you do that, you should see a preview of the finished pattern. You can see my details are not right, but I am getting a patterned instance. And now all I have to do is set the distance and instance count. Right? So I want 2 instances. I want another one over here under this shaft. They need to be separated by 6 inches. Right? That's the distance between the shafts. And I need to reverse the direction. Notice initially it's going to the right. I need it to go to the left. So I check opposite direction. Okay. So opposite direction, that gives me my second V block, right? So now I've patterned that second instance under the second shaft. Now I'm ready to take these 3 parts and pattern all of them along the frame. And this is a question that came up earlier. Is it possible to take something that you created from a pattern and then pattern it again? And the answer is yes. So here I can do another linear pattern, select the V block, the base 2 piece, and then the second V block. And again, we'll do another linear pattern, this time parallel to this edge in the frame. And again, spacing and instance count. I want 12 inches, and I want 5 instances. Okay. And so now I have 12 inches apart for distance and 5 of them going to the end of the frame. Right. Green check. Now I have a simple assembly linear pattern. Okay. Questions that have come up. Does replicate work on edges other than circles, say slots or circular or rectangular cutouts? Yes. It's recognizing the geometry that the part is mated to. If I make a yellow tile rod, and then a green tie rod, can I insert them both into an assembly? So the question is, can you insert um, previous instances of a part into an assembly? You could technically do this, but the key is it would need to belong to a different document. That's the one caveat I would say. When I initially insert this, I would need to insert, if I had a tie rod document that had several versions, I could specify version 1, version 2, and so on when I insert. But they need to be in a separate document to specify that. That would be the one caveat. Can you move the beam to the end of the frame and equally space between beams? And the answer today is no. You would need to do the math manually today to figure out the evenly spaced instances so that it ended exactly as it should. So today, right now, it is just a dumb value, so to speak. It's not referencing the length, so to speak. That's definitely a good improvement for the future. Right now, it's driven solely by the distance and instance count. Question: will rotating the first block rotate all child blocks? No. Can you reference the distance on the assembly? No. Forgive me, I'm jumping through these here. Couldn't you measure using feature script? It's important to keep in mind you cannot use feature script at the assembly level as of today. So there's no feature script support in assemblies as of today. So just keep that in mind. Now, that's a good point to make, though. Could you use something like the evenly spaced instances of a feature script feature? You could at the Part Studio level, but you cannot yet at the assembly level. All right, so that really is what I had planned for you. The simple examples again today, just showing you all the ways that we can insert multiple instances of parts or assemblies at the assembly level. So if you have a lot of the same part that you have to insert over and over and over again, chances are we can automate or at least speed up what you're currently using today. Now, just to recap, the copy and paste is a simple method. Again, it requires you to position it to mate it into place, but it's an easy way to insert multiple parts without having to go to the insert dialog. But when you really get into the automated approaches, things like Replicate and the patterns, that's where you really can speed things up. Replicate is definitely a powerful tool, so I would check that out if you haven't tried it yet. But also simple things like circular pattern and linear pattern can make a part like this very, very easy, or an assembly like this, I should say. So it makes it very easy to insert a lot of instances without having to necessarily mate each one of these in place, right? Especially for a scenario like this where I know that it's just I need one every foot, and so on. A lot of times there are rules like that that are very simple. So linear, circular patterns, Replicate, definitely check them out if you haven't already. Copy and paste part is more of just a big tip that I have for the users. You can use keyboard shortcuts. You can use the right-click menu as a fast way to insert multiple instances. But that's what I had planned. I know there are a few questions left, so bear with me. Forgive me. I'm going to get to them. But for everyone else, I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good day.